OG Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about Section 7 of Belonging again, and we're going to be continuing with the thought of Conyers on tolerance, and we're really going to focus on a very important question that I think is going to have a lot to do with how comfortable we are today with the growth of the state over individual communities. We've talked a lot about how as the state grows, as givens are destabilized, then the likelihood of the banality of evil lessens, but also lessens our capacity to have belonging, which can cause existential anxiety and perhaps make totalitarianism appealing. So there's a ditch on either side of the road. You have the totalitarianism that comes, that is embedded in the possibility of givens, but then the totalitarianism that can be possible in reaction to the loss of givens. And a really important idea that you especially see in conservative circles is the idea that the 20th century was the bloodiest century of all, that more people died in the 20th century than in the centuries past. And Conyers focuses on this because he wants to argue that as tolerance weakens local communities, as power is concentrated in the state and the state grows, so also grows the possibility of total war, of totalization and world war. And it really, it's hard for Conyers to imagine local communities having a lot of power and you having World War I and World War II. And there are other conservative thinkers who have similar thinking. Livingston, in his book on Hume, points out that, and I think it's like Adorno with the dialectics of enlightenment, this idea that rationality, when it's viewed as a totalizing force and that it can succeed at being totalizing and how it's inherently instrumental, how that legacy of the Enlightenment also contributed to totalitarianism. Because if you think rationality is, there are no inherent limits to rationality, that it is essentially capable of doing anything, then why would you stop it? And if you get the most rational people with the most power in the center of the state, then they're going to be able to make the best of all possible worlds. But if it's the case that rationality is not so pure, then you might have some unintended consequences, and those would be the legacies of the 20th century for Livingston, and he believed David Hume foresaw that. And Conyers, contributing to that line of thought from a different angle, wants to say that the spread of the doctrine of tolerance, which for him, I think, does come out of an Enlightenment tradition, because if we can tolerate one another, we can get our bigotries and ideology out of the way and rationality can emerge to the surface. Then the doctrine of tolerance also contributes to the totalization of which made possible total war during the 20th century, and thus World War I, World War II, and perhaps World War III. But this line of conservative thought comes in conflict with Steven Pinker, who wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he argues that humanity is becoming more peaceful through time. In medieval ages, they burned cats for entertainment. The torture and executions that were carried out were unimaginable. And he really wants to point out that there's clearly been some kind of moral evolution through time, where violence that was done in the past we wouldn't even imagine doing today. And he really does take issue as well with the idea that the 20th century was necessarily the most violent. And he gives a very convincing case. I mean, the book's quite thick. I suggest you read it. I'm not going to go through it all here. He even points out how the monopolization of violence by the state was kind of a miracle, and that we really don't appreciate today how great of an evolution that was in human society. So Pinker does not agree that the 20th century was the most violent. And whether or not he's correct, let's just assume he is, and for the sake of argument. If that's the case, would that perhaps suggest that the loss of individual communities, their power to establish permissions and laws of what you can and cannot do, that erosion has been good because it's helped generate peace? And even Conyers acknowledges that the religious wars of the past were quite terrible. Maybe it does. Maybe the trade-off to get rid of the banality of evil by concentrating power in the state, even though perhaps if World War III were to happen, it would be the worst of all possible wars, and perhaps as the state grows, if it were to turn into a dictatorship, it would be the worst of all possible dictatorships. Maybe that potential is never realized. Now it's just something that's lurking that we don't have to worry about, and that's possibly the case. And Steve Pinker also notes that after World War II, we've had this great peace, I guess they call it. There's been some proxy wars, there's been some terrorism, but mostly we've had, and there's been small wars, but mostly we've generally had global peace since after World War II. And that we really should appreciate that, and that also flies in the face of the theory that the 20th century was the most violent. Perhaps this is all true. I'm not sure if human beings today are more peaceful. It does seem to me as if one of the reasons that we're having a more peaceful century is because the cost of war now is so high that it's a matter of deterrence. I'm not sure if human nature itself has evolved and we've become less violent, so much as it is the cost of war is so high. I mean, we'd use nukes. If World War III happened, it'd be nuclear war and we'd all die. And that almost happened with the Cold War. Also, I think social media makes it to where everyone's on film, everything can be filmed, that there's mass transparency, where perhaps rather than us being more peaceful because we've had an enlightenment, perhaps it's based on fear. And I'm not sure if Pinker thinks we are all inherently better. He might. There does seem, I know he is a fan of the notion that the Enlightenment makes us better people, and arguably it doesn't matter if we're more peaceful today because of deterrence or because of Enlightenment, if in fact we are more peaceful and this is the age of the Great Peace. But I don't think we can ignore that if a black swan event were to occur, something that, let's say we had a global debt crisis, let's say China were to invade Japan, it seized all the harbors off Australia, South China Sea, and America was put in a situation, where maybe China doesn't attack America directly, but it gets involved with Japan due to maybe financial reasons. Maybe the Chinese economy collapses and the government has to engage in domestic propaganda, convince its people that it's stronger than it is, and engages in a conflict with Japan. I mean, they still, to this day, remember the rape of Nanjing. That could easily cause a domino effect, of which very quickly we could have a body count that would make the 21st century in the running for the most violent century. So is it a moral evolution if it's simply a matter of the cost of war is so high that we don't engage in war, but there's still the potential for that? It's hard to say. But I do think it would be, nevertheless, foolish to ignore the points that Steve Pinker makes, and to note that as the state grows as a consequence of the loss of local communities to maintain boundaries, that it increases a sense of we can't go to war without it. War is too bad to happen. It would be too big to happen. And so it doesn't happen, that might be considered a good thing. And so perhaps weakening local communities, which weakens the probability of the banality of evil, which weakens the possibility of rootedness and belonging, perhaps that's a good trade-off, because even though it increases the cost of World War, if it were to occur, and the magnitude of a totalitarian regime if it were to take over the state, the likelihood of that horrible potential being realized perhaps lessens, thus making it a good trade-off. That's a possibility, and we'll have to continue with Belonging Again to explore that more. I won't elaborate here. So anyway, that was section 7. We will move on into section 8, where we continue these themes. You can find more at ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.